Hello, comrades, and welcome to another video on the Chinese Revolution area of study 2. This is our third video in our series on the Cultural Revolution. There will be one more to come, going over the chronology of the Cultural Revolution. But this video will focus on the years 1968 to 1976. Here is a quote from Chen Yun. He said, "Had Mao died in 1956, his achievements would have been immortal. Had he died in 1966, he would still have been a great man. But he died in 1976. Alas, what can one say?" So let's start by looking at the Ninth Party Congress. So the Ninth Party Congress, which ran from the 1st to the 24th of April 1969, was said to be the triumphant end of the Cultural Revolution. But in reality, it was transitional rather than conclusive. The Cultural Revolution definitely continued, and even though the sort of key violence of the revolution had been in those early years. Now, 1,512 delegates were represented at the Ninth Party Congress, although they were not all members of the party. A significant number represented Red Guard groups, and there was a marked increase in the size of the PLA delegation, many of whom were loyal to Lin Biao. Now, that will become relevant soon. The Cultural Revolution small group was dissolved at the Ninth Party Congress, and changes to the CCP leadership were apparent as so many had been purged. So veteran party delegates were now outnumbered by new comrades. Military men, as I mentioned up here, made up 2/3 of the Congress. 70 to 80% of regional party cadres had been purged since 1966. So in that 3-year period, or less than 3 years, really, because this was in April and the Cultural Revolution really began in June of 1966. So 70 to 80% of regional cadres had been purged, and only 9 out of 23 Politburo members retained their posts. Mao conceded that the job of the Great Cultural Revolution is not yet finished. Up to the mountains, down to the countryside. So this was a movement launched in 1968, which sent millions of young urban people whose schooling had been disrupted through the Red Guard movement to live with peasants in provincial villages. Between 1968 and 1972, about 17 million young people were sent down to the villages, some voluntarily and some forced. Liang Heng, who was one of these young people who went to the countryside, is quoted as saying, "Above all, they went because Chairman Mao told them to go. I imagined how we would plow, plant, and eat what we grew and be able to respect ourselves again." Now, the harsh conditions of rural China made going to the countryside a very trying experience for most urban youth. Zheng Chang herself was a Red Guard and had gone to the countryside. This experience made Zheng Chang, as well as many other former Red Guards, critical of the revolution after seeing the bleakness of peasant life. They saw that what life was like in the countryside and started asking questions about how successful the revolution had actually been. Now, at the same time, a rural education program for urban party cadres began, and this was known as the May 7th Cadre Schools. Up to 1/3 of staff from some party organizations attended these schools at any one time. So it was the same as the up to the mountains, down to the countryside, but for urban cadres. Cadres carried out heavy labor for between 6 months and 3 years. And the May 7th schools were designed to keep city officials humble and remind them of the values of the Yan'an days, to try and encourage them to empathize with the peasants. Now, not all was bad. There were many improvements in rural life. So while many in the cities suffered during the Cultural Revolution, rural life improved significantly. So let's look at 4 key areas in which this was the case. So in education, tons of schools were opened up. So in 1976, there were 15 times more rural junior middle schools than there had been in 1965. In politics, as old party structures came under strain and many cadres had been purged, the election of village leaders became more independent, which meant that the peasantry gained greater political autonomy and were able to participate in economic and social decisions like they never had before. In terms of agricultural output, while I don't have any statistics to back this up, rural industries did produce farm tools, fertilizers, pesticides, irrigation equipment, etc. And regional machinery companies gave rural people better access to tractors and diesel pumps during the later years of the Cultural Revolution. This increased farmers' efficiency and greatly increased agricultural output. Now, that health was a huge area where life had improved for peasants. So an initiative was brought in called Barefoot Doctors, which trained everyday people in basic medicine and sent them to the countryside. Millions of peasants received regular health checks, and also the price and availability of basic medicines also improved. So medicines were more readily available and were cheaper. So because of these Cultural Revolution health initiatives by the CCP, life expectancy increased dramatically. So in 1949, the average life expectancy in China was 35 years. By 1957, that had grown to 57 years. And by 1975, so just a year before Mao's death, the life expectancy had grown to 63 years. So life expectancy had almost doubled in a 26-year period, which is quite remarkable. Now, cleansing the class ranks. Violence was a key feature of the Cultural Revolution in the cities, but it also spread to the countryside in 1967 and 1968 through the Cleansing the Class Ranks movement. This movement targeted anyone seen as an opponent of new revolutionary committees. It was meant to be against people within the party or people involved in politics, but it resulted in collective killings of approximately 1.5 million people carried out by peasants or village militia. Some people used the campaign to target their own personal enemies, and many victims were ordinary people with no connection to political activity. Guangxi province was particularly affected. So in July to August 1967, more than 3,600 people were killed in just 11 days, including children and the elderly. And 176 whole households were exterminated. So entire families wiped out. The Cleansing the Class Ranks purges were less visible than the actions of the Red Guard movement, but were still, according to historian Krauss, the most violent aspect of the Cultural Revolution. Now, I mentioned Lin Biao in our last video. He was a key force of the Cultural Revolution. But he had a swift fall from grace. So after the Ninth Party Congress, when Lin Biao was named Mao's successor, he wanted to strengthen his position. Mao had been critical of the military's treatment of cadres during the 1966 to 1969 purges, and Mao had also been leaning much more heavily on Zhou Enlai rather than Lin Biao. So Lin Biao really wanted to suck up to Mao after the Ninth Party Congress. Mao wished to revise the constitution to abolish the post of president. He didn't see it as necessary in this new revolutionary China. But on the 11th of April 1970, Lin Biao called several other leaders and suggested that the presidency should be, as a post, should be retained and filled by Mao. He did this really trying to, like I said, suck up to Mao. However, Mao did not want the presidency, and he didn't want the post of president to still exist in China. So the Politburo backed Lin's proposal, but Mao rejected it, and he was furious at Lin Biao. Now, at the Lushan plenum, which we've looked at a Lushan plenum in the past, but this is another one, slightly confusing, I know, of April 1970, Mao knew that a direct attack on Lin Biao would cause trouble with the PLA, who were really loyal to Lin Biao. And as we had seen at the Ninth Party Congress of 1969, the PLA held significant power within the PRC, with 2/3 of the people at the Congress being affiliated with the military and thus affiliated with Lin Biao. So knowing that a direct attack on Lin Biao would cause trouble, Mao denounced and imprisoned Chen Boda, his former speechwriter and an ally of Lin Biao's. Mao then spent the rest of 1970 and early 1971 undermining Lin Biao by purging military officials immediately below Lin, appointing men he trusted to strategic military roles, and securing control of the armed forces in the Beijing region. Lin knew he had fallen from Mao's favor and became chronically depressed after this. Now, Lin's son Tiger, an Air Force officer, was furious at Mao's treatment of his father. And so he recruited a team and conspired to kill Mao. They had planned to strike Mao while he was on a train, but the plan failed, or word got out, and Mao's train returned to Beijing. So when the plan failed, Tiger went to his family and told them everything and said, "We need to leave." And the family tried to escape to the USSR in Tiger's jet. However, it's said that Tiger's jet was low on fuel already, but they left just in the nick of time. So around 2 a.m. on 13th of September 1971, the jet is said to have run out of fuel. Some argue that it was shot down, and it crashed in Mongolia, killing everyone on board, including Lin Biao. Now, denunciations of Lin continued after his death. He became a figure of treachery, hatred, and condemnation, and was targeted in a hostile propaganda campaign launched by the Gang of Four in 1973, known as Criticize Lin Biao and Confucius. So Mao's last years, Mao's health began to deteriorate from around 1973, and the PRC started to adopt more moderate policies, although Jiang Qing's Gang of Four was still encouraging radical campaigns. The 10th Party Congress of August 1973 convened to elect new members to positions and to condemn Lin Biao as a right opportunist who, quote, waved the red flag to defeat the red flag. With the help of Deng Xiaoping, he had early on been a key target of the revolution, but in the 1970s, particularly 1972 and 1973, he'd been granted permission to return to Beijing and was reappointed to the Central Committee. So Deng Xiaoping and Zhou Enlai outlined a 4 modernizations program to improve agriculture, industry, national defense, and science and technology. This was approved in January 1975. Now, 1976 is the year of deaths among CCP leaders. So Zhou Enlai died of cancer on the 8th of January. Zhu Dai died on the 6th of July. Remember, Zhu Dai was Mao's great ally at the Jiangxi Soviet. And in September, Mao suffered a severe heart attack, passing away on the 9th of September. This led to a great deal of mourning, as did Zhou Enlai's death, actually, among the people of China. But there was unease about what would happen next. The PLA quickly moved against the Gang of Four because, China had moved towards more moderate policies, and the Gang of Four were this extremist group that were trying to install extremely radical and violent actions. So on the 6th of October 1976, Jiang Qing and her cronies of the Gang of Four were arrested and imprisoned. You'll remember the photo of the Gang of Four taken after their arrest in 1976 from my last video. So this led to much celebration by the public. A couple of years later, Deng Xiaoping assumed the role of chairman, and China began an enormous revolutionary modernization program, which really launched them to become this economic powerhouse in the world. So that brings us to the end of our entire study, but let's have a look at some historical interpretations first about the Cultural Revolution. So Philip Short said to bring into existence his new world, the chairman had reached back to his roots, to the bedrock of his thoughts, to the days when China was ruled by a son of heaven, to forge an emperor system whose limitless power, once harnessed to revolutionary goals, could build the red utopia to which he pinned his dreams. So Philip Short here is saying that Mao was aiming to become like an emperor. Zhong Chang and John Halliday. Remember, Zhong Chang was a Red Guard herself. They are quoted as saying, in June 1966, Mao intensified the terrorization of society. He picked at his first instrument of terror, young people in schools and universities. These students were told to condemn their teachers and those in charge of education for poisoning their heads with bourgeois ideas. To spread terror deeper and closer to home, Mao got the young thugs to make violent raids on victims selected by the state. And finally, let's look at Michael Lynch. Michael Lynch said, it may even be that, on occasion, the Cultural Revolution was pushed further than Mao had intended. He himself once said Jiang Qing and the Gang of Four were more Maoist than he was. But none of this absolves Mao from the responsibility for what occurred. Everything was done in his name. He could have called off the terror any time he wanted, but he chose not to. By leaving Jiang and the extremists in control, he sanctioned what they did to the Chinese people. So that brings us to the end of our study of the Cultural Revolution. As I said, I'll release one more video outlining the chronology of the Cultural Revolution, because I know it is very confusing and a bit disjointed. But until that next time, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll see you soon.